Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure, but also difficult task for me to round off what we have heard here in the 2 recent days. And in order to do so, I will take the liberty of using the famous Imperial Palace of Poznań as a kind of external occasion to condense some of the points we have discussed at length during this conference. I would like to start with the main three terms in the title of our conference, namely renovatio, translatio, and imperium. Of course, we have spoken at length about the idea of empire, but even after so many papers on empire, we must conclude that we have not even scratched the surface of the complexity of this concept, about which entire libraries have been written. In order to clarify the debate, I would like to differentiate between two closely related spectrums of meaning of empire. On the one hand, we have what I would call the genuine, original imperial idea, which has two closely interwoven dimensions. First, the, at least ideologically given, spatial unboundedness of an empire, which nevertheless generally admits that only a certain part of the known world is placed under direct imperial administration, since it is assumed that the rest of humanity is in an implicit client relationship. Whether it is the ancient Egyptian empire, the empires of Sumer and Akkad, the Assyrian empire, the Persian empire, the Roman empire, the Chinese Han empire, and many others, they all saw themselves as universal empires, and on the basis of their respective geographical knowledge, also had an honest right to this self-representation. Then there is the transcendent component closely related to spatial infinity. The empire is not simply one state among many, but a system of order that is directly instituted and guaranteed by the highest of all known authorities of God. Amun, Enlil, Tian, Zeus, or Ahura Mazda, and thus in many respects reflects the divine world order, so that by implication, any contravention of the empire must at the same time be an offense against the gods. Both characteristics logically offer numerous points of connection to possible successor empires. Since the empire is geographically unlimited, it is quite possible for a successor entity that is itself partly located on this territory to place itself in a privileged continuity with its predecessor. And since the empire is divinely willed, it is, as it were, part of an eternal world plan, and thus not only immanent, but also supratemporal, which also makes it easy for successors to identify themselves as heirs to an empire, even in much later times, without this having to appear, at least theologically, forced. This also leads to a third point that is usually not much discussed in research on empires, namely the fact that these empires are closely connected to individual civilizations and must therefore actually be understood as regular attempts to transform the cultural unity of these civilizations into political unities. A civilization being understood here as the largest collective political and cultural actor right below the level of humanity. This also reveals the difference between the renovatio, which must be seen as the restoration of an imperial polity gone not too long ago, and the translatio, which generally only begins after a longer period of time and often operates even in between and across civilizations. This already leads over to the difference between genuine, that is, civilizational empires, and those states we only call empires due to unclear terminology. This, as it were, secondary use of the term regularly has two possible reasons. On the one hand, it is quite common in history for states that do not fulfill some or even all of the three criteria mentioned above, that is, unlimitedness, divine approval, and unification of a civilizational space, to nevertheless try to place themselves in the continuity of those genuine empires, and therefore also adopt their name and even parts of their ideology without having the same meaning behind them. Thus, for example, the Anglo-Saxon and Angevine empires also based their legitimation, at least in part, directly on Roman traditions, without us seriously regarding them as genuine successor states to the Imperium Romanum or even parts of ancient history. On the other hand, although closely related to the earlier point, there is also the qualification of states as empires by later, usually European historiography, often merely because of their size or political importance, as in the case of the Spartan Empire, the Carthaginian Empire, or the Belgian colonial empire. But what do these various points have to do with the Imperial Palace of Poznań? In order to answer this question, let us first take a closer look at the history of the building and of the region. The construction of the Poznań Residence Castle between 1905 and 1910 is impossible to understand without a brief historical review. Poznań, the first Polish episcopal see since 968, burial place of the early Polish kings and royal residence since 1295, belongs with the surrounding voivodeship of Wielkopolska to the core areas of the Polish state, even though a German settlement founded by Przemysl I, according to Magdeburg law, had been located on the territory of the city since 1253. In 1793, Poznań fell to Prussia as part of the Second Polish Partition, and, with the exception of the Napoleonic period, remained a part of Prussia, and since 1870 of the German Reich, until the Poznań uprising in 1918. The Prussian administration was originally quite liberal and tolerated a certain degree of political and cultural autonomy of the formerly Polish territories, while the early German national movements saw the authoritarian monarchies as their main opponents and fraternized with Polish, Hungarian, or Italian independence fighters. After the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, however, and the increasing self-justification of Prussia as the motor of German unification, the pressure grew on the Poles in Greater Poland and Poznań, which still constituted the overwhelming majority of these territories. The teaching of the Polish language was massively obstructed, the Catholic Church was oppressed, the rural population was put under pressure, while at the same time, large-scale and state-subsidized settlement attempts with German citizens were launched by organizations such as the Ostmarkenverein, and a massive propaganda campaign took place at schools, academies, and universities in order to suggest the alleged superiority of German Kultur. Poznań in particular was to become a model German city, quite analogous to Strasbourg, by the way, and was generously equipped with a German theater, a modern library, and a museum of German and European art, while Polish private associations strove to establish their own theater, their own library as well. The high point, however, was to be the construction of a German forum after the old fortress grounds in the west of the city were laid down. Alongside a royal academy, a new municipal theater, a Protestant church, a Lark Bismarck monument, a credit institute for large landowners, and the infamous settlement commission, of a formal royal and imperial residence palace for Wilhelm II was to be built, one of the last palace buildings in European history. Built by Franz Heinrich Schwechten, Wilhelm II's favorite architect and famous for the Rhine Bridge in Cologne, the building was to be the counterpart to the Hochkönigsburg in Alsace, which was renovated at about the same time. Like the latter, it was intended to mark the outermost settlement points of the German Empire and to signify the claim to these territories, which were mainly populated by French and Poles, respectively. The huge building stood in deliberate antagonism to the medieval Polish Jagiellonian castle only a few hundred meters away, was built in a simplified neo-Romanesque style, and thrived on the tension between the towering keep, which even had a neo-Norman palace chapel inside, and the large throne room, whose outer facade harked back to the columned arcades of Aachen Cathedral. The interior of the Kaiserpfalz was also largely neo-Romanesque, with the throne room picking up Byzantine elements, while the private rooms were partly even in a Scandinavian-influenced pseudo-Old Norse Germanic style. Inaugurated in 1910, the huge palace remained unused, and in December 1918 fell to the Polish state, which converted it into a presidential palace, dedicated the Wilhelminian chapel to the Mother of God of Częstochowa, and recast the Bismarck monument into a statue of Christ, but otherwise made hardly any structural changes. In September 1939, however, Greater Poland and with it Poznań once again came under German rule and was transformed into the Reichsgau Wartheland. Wartheland was to be transformed into a German model country within the framework of National Socialist policy. The Polish elite was deliberately identified and eliminated in the first days of the war. The Polish population was subjected to numerous harassment, forcible resettlements, and genocidal measures. The Gauleiter was Arthur Greiser, who set up quarters in the second floor of the pseudo-Kaiserpfalz and suggested to Adolf Hitler to convert the first floor into a formal Führer's seat, which Hitler accepted enthusiastically. As a principle, however, Hitler consciously avoided to be associated with any building connected to the monarchy, but made a telling exception for the Poznań Kaiserpfalz under the condition of a complete interior redesign. On Speer's advice, the work was entrusted to Franz Böhmer, who completely gutted the representative rooms of the palace, including the Nordic elements, and rebuilt them in the typical neoclassical style of National Socialism. The most notable interventions were the transformation of the old pseudo-medieval coat of arms hall into a long representative gallery, the conversion of the ground floor of the keep into a car entrance, the construction of a new representative staircase, and the conversion of the pseudo-Norman Byzantine chapel into the Führer's study, including the installation of the obligatory Führer's balcony. When the war forced a far-reaching standstill from 1943 onwards, the rebuilding was largely completed, except for the conversion of the throne room into a banqueting hall, explaining why the volumes are still largely unfinished today. Converted into a military hospital, the castle was only superficially damaged in 1945 and 1944, and after the restoration of the Polish state, it was quickly converted into a new town hall, as the acute lack of space made it impossible to blow up the building as many had demanded. The Führer study became the seat of the city president, the festival hall, the meeting hall of the city's administration, and the gallery was redesigned in 1966 by the artist Richard Skupin into a monument to the socialist reinterpretation of Polish history. Lack of money, however, made an exterior redesign in the Soviet style impossible. Even the spire was never redesigned in the Stalinist style as planned initially and remains flat to this day. In 1956, the palace became the center of the tragic Poznań uprising of the 28th June, the first large-scale demonstration against the communist regime, the suppression of which resulted in 76 deaths and 900 injured. In 1962, the castle finally became a cultural center and multifunction building, with the former throne room being transformed today into a cinema. Now, this brief description already hinted at the numerous instances of imperial renovatio and translatio intended by the powers commissioning the Poznań Palace and its refurbishings. In the following, let us briefly dissect both three main construction phases. As far as Emperor Wilhelm II is concerned, his desire to link the Poznań Residence Castle to the high medieval German history is more than obvious, with four periods in particular coming to mind here. Firstly, the general design of the building, which is clearly based on the Romanesque architecture of the 12th and 13th century, is thus naturally intended to refer to the high medieval imperial period just before the interregnum, a period which, in the historical interpretation of the 19th century, was usually considered as the climax of a sacrum imperium understood as a German proto-national state, which then supposedly lapsed into chaos and petty statehood and was only awakened from its slumber by the wars of liberation of the 19th century. Furthermore, we see in the pseudo-Normannic palace chapel, which is clearly based on the architecture of Palermo, a recourse to the medieval Mediterranean with its rich tapestry of late antique, Byzantine and Muslim traditions, all unlocked by the Crusades and imported to Northwest Europe, a fascination that was also shared by the travel-loving Kaiser Wilhelm II, whose journey to Jerusalem is universally known. The pseudo-Byzantine design of the palace chapel must also be seen in the confessional context of Poznań, whose predominantly Polish population was Catholic. A Byzantine exotizing sacred space was certainly more justifiable from a politically German national and confessionally Protestant perspective than the historically correct recourse to classical high medieval church architecture, which couldn't but be associated with the unloved Catholicism. Thus, the architectural realization of the notion of empire seems largely reduced to the romanticized idea of medieval Germany and its dreams of the distant and exotic Mediterranean. The fact, however, that the Sacrum Imperium, whose heritage is so prominently claimed by Wilhelm II, also incorporated such areas as Burgundy, Flanders, Lombardy, Venetia, Bohemia, even parts of today's Denmark and Poland, and that only a few, if any, emperors would have considered themselves and their empire to be somehow German, is completely left outside of the symbolic program of the Wilhelminian Poznań Castle. Let us mention two further analyses. While the palace literally revels in allusions to the architecture of the Ottonians and the Hohenstaufen, the Carolingian past is quite absent, which is easy to explain given the fact that not only Germany, but also and perhaps even foremost France claimed the Carolingian heritage for its own, while Charlemagne's eradication of German paganism in favor of Christianity had become quite unpopular with the early folkish enthusiasts of the 19th century. We can only mention some interior paintings with scenes from the life of Charlemagne and the design of the throne room with its massive and archaic window design reminiscent of the arcades of the Imperial Cathedral in Aachen, which also, by the way, underwent a massive restoration program under Wilhelm II in order to strip it of its Baroque Catholic look and give it a more Byzantine, pre-confessional somehow interior. At last, let us mention the use of Nordic designs in some of the emperor's more private living quarters, and even the placing of an entire Nordic room. Although these spaces were not part of the large-scale official representational program of the palace, they nevertheless reflect the fascination of the emperor, of his entourage, and his time for the Nordic Germanic roots of the Germans, and show once again that Wilhelm II, like his architect and interior designer, saw Prussia's rule over the empire in general and the province of Poznań in particular, not in the continuity with the supranational Sacrum Imperium rooted in West Francia and inseparably linked to the Catholic tradition and to the still reigning Habsburg, but rather of a romanticized medieval polity reduced to the role of trigger of German nation building. How can these phenomena be captured by the terms renovatio or translatio? We witness a renovatio insofar as the Wilhelminian Second Empire saw itself as the successor state of the Holy Roman, that is the First Empire, but not in the sense of a real ideological or even constitutional continuity with the latter and the state it achieved in early modern times, regularly dismissed by contemporary historiography with terms such as Kleinstaaterei, Flickenteppich, or Deutsche Ohnmacht, but rather in the sense of a romanticized nationalist narrowing down of the medieval Sacrum Imperium to a purely German proto-national empire. The Sacrum Imperium had lost throughout the centuries, many peripheral, usually non-German speaking territories to the neighboring states, so that in the end, what remained of the empire corresponded largely to the German cultural sphere. However, neither the Habsburgs, nor the Hohenstaufen, or the Ottonians, and certainly not the Carolingians, would ever have perceived this century-long evolution as national consolidation, but only as the unwelcome consequence of the expansionist energy of the neighboring states, above all France and Spain, and of the insurgent Protestant nobles. That the imperium, in the end, became Germany was not somehow the result of its eternal folkish essence, but rather of the slow failure of the old imperial and multicultural model, whose death was not administered by Napoleon, but by the Kleindeutsche Lösung in the 1860s, when an extension of the empire from the North Sea to the Carpathians, and thus its total multicultural reconstruction and its Catholic also dominance, would have still be possible, but then was replaced by this Kleindeutsche Lösung. For Wilhelm II, however, the medieval empire was an archaic German nation-state entity whose multicultural character was not interpreted as essential to its identity, but rather as a consequence of some form of imperial oversaturation, and whose non-German population groups were consequently understood as minorities and thus subordinated to the German Reichsvolk. Of course, this affected above all the largest minority of the Wilhelminian Empire, the Poles, who, after still having been considered synonymous with the Italic, Gallic, and Germanic parts of the empire under the Ottonians, now found themselves everywhere in Wielkopolska, Silesia, Pomerania, West and East Prussia as an unwelcome minority, which not only suffered from a virulent Germanization policy, but also became the victim of Bismarck's anti-Catholic policy and were thus discriminated against by the Second Reich precisely because of the very religious confession on which the First Reich, the Sacrum Imperium, had originally been built. This romantic nationalist interpretation of history, obsessed by the glories of the Middle Ages, was to undergo a radical reinterpretation under National Socialism and its racial doctrine, so that it is hardly surprising that Hitler, once Poznań again under German control, had no choice but to almost completely gut the representational and residential rooms of the castle, which was only 3 decades old then, in order to dismiss the legacy of the Second Reich, the reaction, and to make the castle a symbolic beacon of the Third Reich's policy towards the East. But already the term of Third Reich is an important keyword here, because even though the term is still regularly used today, as I did, it should be borne in mind that it officially was abolished as a self-description quite early on by Hitler himself, who didn't want that the term Drittes Reich was used as a self-designation of his state. In contrast to Wilhelm II, Hitler was not interested in reviving the medieval empire, nor was he interested in linking up with the eschatological ideas inseparably associated with the name of Joachim von Flores, and thus with Judeo-Christian theology, which Hitler abhorred. This also explains why the neo-Norman Palace Chapel was ruthlessly removed and a significant overlay, its spatial volume, used as the basis for Hitler's study. Indeed, Hitler could do little with Wilhelm's fascination with the Holy Land, the Byzantine heritage, the Crusades, and the Muslim past of Southern Europe. The continuities he wanted to draw focused neither on the medieval empire nor on the early Germanic period, and certainly not on the late antique or early medieval Mediterranean, but rather on classical antiquity. It is well known how much Hitler despised Himmler for the fascination with ancient Germanic archaeology, while he himself repeatedly emphasized explicitly that the Greeks and Romans, with whom the Germans allegedly shared not only cultural but also direct biological kinship ties due to their common Indo-European Aryan heritage, had to be placed in the foreground as the true ancestors of the modern National Socialist state. Greeks, Romans, Germanic tribes, following to Hitler and his sources such as Gobineau or Rosenberg, they all appear as the successively flourishing branches of a single racial history, which only now in the National Socialist state of the 20th century had found the full consciousness of its own being. For this reason, Hitler did not care for renovatio of the first Holy Roman Empire, and even less of the second Wilhelminian Empire, but rather strived for a new translatio of the Greek-Roman cultural and imperial heritage until National Socialist Germany. Such a recourse across the centuries, even millennia, also meant a new approach towards ancient architecture, which Hitler honored as the unsurpassed pinnacle of Aryan art and preferred by far to Wilhelminian historicism. So that in Poznań, too, he replaced the Wilhelminian interior with a neoclassical design reminiscent of the representative buildings of Berlin, Nuremberg, or Munich, which all, however, were only a small hint of the urban transformations to come after the hoped-for victory of Germany in the Second World War. It is an irony of history that after the end of the Second World War, in the very spaces that were supposed to exemplify Hitler's hypertrophied and murderous historical ambitions, as well as his charismatic conception of rule, a third form of historical interpretation was now to be anchored, namely the visualization of the continuity of Polish history, despite manifold territorial shifts, state dissolutions, and genocidal exterminations. Poznań, from a German perspective, a German city and gateway to that phantasmagorical German East that was to earn the country a position of European dominance, now became, from a Polish perspective, once again, the ancient royal city that since the earliest beginnings of Polish history had symbolized the state tradition and continuity of the country and made the German presence a mere episode in the context of centuries of continuity. While at the same time, the westward shift of Poland imposed by Stalin led to an abandonment of the old Jagiellonian vision of a multicultural and multi-religious Eastern Poland and a recentering on the foundations of the Polish states under the Piasts a long time before the personal union with Lithuania. It is therefore no coincidence that the Wilhelminian Hall of coat of arms, which Wappensaal, which had been converted by the National Socialists into a stately neoclassical gallery, was again transformed in 1966 into a veritable apotheosis of Polish historical continuity on the occasion of the 1000th anniversary of Poland, and that Poznań was idealized as the center of the struggle against the German drive to the east, albeit in a characteristic socialist reinterpretation of the events in terms of their deeper Marxist meaning, according to which golden age finally dawned for Poland in 1945, thanks to the liberation by the Red Army. Obviously, this socialist revamping of one of the halls of the Wilhelminian Palace could scarcely be the last word in the difficult reconstruction and reaffirmation of Poznań's and Poland's identity, so that it was commonly felt that only the reconstruction of the Jagiellonian Castle, which was destroyed in 1945 and had been one of the reasons for Wilhelm II to supplant the royal Polish continuity by the supposed imperial German continuity, could render her true identity to the city. It would fall considerably short of the mark to dwell on the artificiality of the rebuilding, of rebuilding a destroyed medieval building in 2012 with rather modern-looking bricks and a certain neglect for the original interior. For what is at stake here was not merely a punctual restitution of a striking urban landmark, but rather the physical reaffirmation of Polish historical continuity, and thus also the right to claim Poznań once again as a foundational city of the Polish state instead of a German Tor zum Osten. Ancient Rome, the Carolingian Empire, the Sacrum Imperium, the German Age of Chivalry, the Italian Normans, the Muslim heritage, Wilhelminian pomp, National Socialist, murderous neoclassicism, socialist realism, they all appear in Poznań's Imperial Palace in a rare and remarkably condensed, sometimes even absurd and grotesque way, not only as a symbolic reification of purely abstract identity construction, but rather as an architectural expression of ideologies whose immediate consequences led to incredible suffering, genocide, bloodshed, and expulsions in the very same city. Empires, as the history of the last month has shown us so forcefully, are not innocent and abstract concepts, but regulative ideas, often enough triggering far-reaching collective consequences from which, depending on the conditions, both brutal war and centuries of peace and prosperity can arise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for this insightful case study, which wraps up our second day. But first, I invite any questions that the audience might have.
Thank you. This was really very interesting and very good, I must say. It's very inspiring. I have some comments, some questions. First of all, I agree that we have to talk about empire also with the context of transcendence, with political theology. So probably we have to differentiate something. If there is a Christianity, there's some other vision of the empire. But then we have the conclusion would be, and I wanted to ask you if you agree. The conclusion would be that in the secularized world, there's no place for empire, because so when Entzauberung is total, if it is, yeah, disenchantment, then there is when there is no theological moment in the politics, then there is no possibility to have an empire. So you showed that this secularization of the second German Empire was already secularized. Yeah, but there are some interesting, let's say, from history of religion, this Protestant Kulturkampf, and also the revival of Catholicism, of apparition of the Mary in Marpingen, for instance. So there is also some kind of the new religious energy in the politics. But okay, we'll say this is secularization, and then interesting that the next step would be the so-called Third Reich with this very biological racist basis. So in the sense when we are talking, and probably tomorrow, if Europe, the Union is empire, it's empire in a different way, without any references to the transcendence. But first, I wanted to point out that in many cases, because you said this secularization is going together with nationalization. Holy Roman Empire became a German, and we can see in this building, this was very good analysis. Yeah, but there's, I think, from the Polish perspective, I must say that there's, in a way, in our political theology, also the nation has this transcendental dimension. If you look, for instance, Krasiński, Polish history, looked from the perspective of Trinity. Yeah, of course, it's a typical from Romanticism. We had, I think, a month ago here in the conference about Romanticism. But this is actually still, in a way, still alive. Of course, probably the the last representative of this kind of thinking, which expressed this directly, was John Paul II, about Polish nation. If you take his book, Identity and Memory, even more, I think that he was also the great supporter of the European integration, because he saw this in this, not precisely, but at least in this, also in this history of redemption. Yeah, this is not only secular history. There's something to do. And I think that one of the reasons also today of the tension between, we are talking then previously about Poland and let's say this construction of European Union is based on law and the rules, and totally secular, in which religion is something which is totally private. This is still this presence of this political theological moment in Polish identity or in the Polish political community. I don't know if you agree in this. Probably it's exceptional. I don't know. In Europe, I don't know. And that's the question. How is in German? Because you said, of course, that there's a secularization and this national socialism and the creation, this unification of Europe in this way was based on racism. But on the other hand, we have intellectuals, the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, according to me, and the greatest national socialist philosopher, Heidegger, with reference to Hölderlin, and he supported this, yeah, because of this, yeah, this is, in a way, it is, when Grzegorz Kucharczyk was talking about German idealism, it is also transformation of this idea. So my question is it really, it was really totally without any messianic, let's say, messianic ideas? And the second question is concerning, yeah, is there any empire today as a place in this? This was the first question. Is this actually, that the secularization is really total, or do you see some the sacral moments even today in the European Union and some other nation than only Poland?
Yeah, thank you very much for your remarks. Of course, I cannot answer to this rich variety of different allusions and remarks you made, with whom with which I very largely agree. Perhaps just some fleeting notes I took. So yes, we see, of course, in the 19th and 20th century German political theology, this shift, let's say, from classical transcendence that is rooted in Catholicism, or if possible in some form of Protestantism, to a semi-mystic idealization of folkish identity, where even National Socialism, which is a materialist, fundamentally materialist and anti-idealist doctrine, which is basically socialism turned upside down in many respects, which is exactly as materialist as is communism, where nevertheless this racist ideas are then imbued with some pseudo-mystical, romantic, bit pantheist ideas of the eternal blood and God somehow conditioning all that. So this vague, let's say, pseudo-religious covering that we find sometimes in Hitler's discourses or texts, but which is some form of sugarcoating. Basically, there's nothing else than you could say a pseudo theological overloading of basically materialist ideology. So much to that. And apart from that, yeah, of course, we see in the 19th, but essentially 20th century in the West, a massive decrease of any references to transcendence. Still, the founding fathers of the European institutions had still this, let's say, this religious Christian background, with whom they thought that these European institutions would somehow be linked to Christian democracy. I think of Schumann, for example, and his hope in a Christian democracy without whom democracy would be void, and so forth. But by now, indeed, it may seem as if this endeavor to a transcendence, charging of political identities has disappeared in favor of the Kantian, rationalist, purely pragmatic and universalist approach, which ends, unfortunately, in some form of relativism and nihilism. But I think we see, nevertheless, at least at the fringes of the European Union, some signs that this must not be a one-way process. You alluded, of course, to still the very strong presence of religious feeling and the need for transcendence in Poland. We could also make allusion to the new Hungarian constitution, which tries to use the reference to the St. Stephen crowns as the ultimate sovereign of the Hungarian political entity, is also some form of semi-transcendent symbol linking also back to God, the destiny of the Hungarian people and so forth. So that there we have already two examples, and as we all know, there is also a very specific sense of, let's say, Christian identity, even Christian teleological salvation identity when we look at Spain, at France still, even in Italy. Now, of course, these more Christian elements are largely in the minority. They are rooted in 1,000 years of history, but still they are now not in the majority. But things like that can, of course, change. I will just refer to the excellent lecture by Greg Levitsky, who has shown that sooner or later, without the creation of something in between these two radical poles, you have shown as some form of binder, as you called it, some form of, let's say, light culture that is in itself not justified by permanent democratical redefinition, but that is rather taken from history and presented as some form of regulative idea, that only such an approach can more or less stabilize and in effect guarantee this multiculturalism as it exists in its true diversity, and hinder it to become just a playground for civil wars or things like that. So I do not necessarily think that it is impossible that some form of transcendental reference may come back in politics. And of course, as the ancient historian as I am, I can only allude to of course, to Augustus, and to Augustus' endeavor to recreate artificially, of course, and even cynically, but still to recreate some form of traditional Roman religion as some form of ulterior transcendent justification for his own rule. I very much doubt that most people of the Roman elite would really have believed in this new form of Roman religion imposed by Augustus, but it worked also as some form of ideological cement to keep all that together. So as you know, I don't think it is impossible, even rather highly probable, that we may go also through somewhat similar events in the next 20 years, which does not mean that I find them particular positive or negative, but as more or less unavoidable. So that could be a perspective on this spectrum of questions and ideas.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, for taking us on this tour de force through this ever-ending rethinking and restructuring of this palace. So this whole idea, or the ideas we are talking about, it condensed in one single building. I particularly like the quotes that you showed from Hitler's horrible monologues, and we are discussing this also in the Ideengeschichte der Archäologie, in the history of ideas and archaeology. Even it's always funny to see how much Hitler loathed Himmler's attempts to glorify Germanic culture, as far as he understood it, and also including especially the Bronze Ages, which is totally pointless, however. But there was an enormous effort put into that. And there is this wonderful example, I'll close with this anecdote because it fits somehow, of the Wasserburg Buchau that was excavated by Hans Reinhardt. It's a Bronze Age a lakeside dwelling, and there's not much else than post holes and pits and not very much else. Nothing to really show, and only specialists can really understand where the buildings once stood. So when one of these delegations of the Ahnenerbe visited this place, there was this overnight decision to at least put hearths in the center of these excavated dwellings to give it the impression of what was understood as being, yeah, the home of a typical Germani family, and this romantic idea that they gather around a central hearth. And this was reconstructed with original materials, but it was totally nonsense, of course. However, this idea was then further developed into the approach to reconstruct the buildings more thoroughly, hence the birth of the idea of the open air museum. This is the beginning of it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's of course we have to not to focus only on Hitler, because as we know, this form of more, let's say, chaotic government he instituted permitted, of course, many different approaches. And so he, of course, he never reined in Himmler also. He never stopped him. So he personally loathed it, made fun of it, and had not much affinity with this Germanic stuff, but still, of course, he condoned things like Ahnenerbe, like some history books, like Himmler's murderous things and so forth. But indeed, yeah, for himself and for the projects which were important to him, so essentially architecture, of course, this had to be radically neoclassicist. Only here in Poznań, well, he couldn't quite just raise the thing down. So he had to grudgingly conserve somehow this neo-Romanesque exterior, but nothing of that is indeed left in the interior. And that is one of the proofs of this still not so very well-known thing. Many people associate Hitler and so on to this form of idealization of some form of Germanity or German history, and totally overlooked that for him, as he even very often explicitly said, the true persons of or culture of reference is classical Greece and classical Rome, even though, of course, in a typically national socialist, racialist reading of classical antiquity, where it is not the Athenian democracy, but rather the Spartan aristocracy, and where it is, of course, not the Roman Empire with its multiculturalism, but rather the early or middle Roman Republic in its fight against Semitic Carthage, which is the point of reference. So we should, of course, stress also that when speaking of Hitler's liking for classical antiquity, it is not necessarily what we would now understood as classical antiquity, but rather also a very specific and murderous reading of this antiquity.